Hey writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Joni, Author Engagement Specialist at Kobo Writing Life.
And I'm Rachel, Author Engagement Coordinator at Kobo Writing Life. Today is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, which honors the lost children and survivors of residential schools, their families, and their communities. To acknowledge this, we wanted to share a conversation with Kobo's Diversity and Inclusion Committee featuring Kobo Emerging Writer Prize winner Michelle Good. Michelle spoke to us about her writing and about her book, Five Little Indians, which tackles the experience of survivors from residential schools.
This was a really wonderful conversation, and Michelle was an extremely insightful guest. We hope that you listen and enjoy and learn a lot, as we definitely did. We did also want to just give you a heads up as you're listening that she is discussing residential schools, so she does talk about the topics of racism and child abuse, so we just wanted to give you a little warning. We hope you enjoy the interview.
All right, welcome everyone. And obviously welcome Michelle as well. Just to begin, though we're meeting virtually, we would like to acknowledge that Kobo headquarters are on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. We are grateful to work on this land. My name is Alyssa Andino. I am the manager of campaign production here at Kobo, and I'm very excited to introduce Michelle Good as well. Michelle is of Cree ancestry, a descendant of the Battle River Cree and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation. She has worked with Indigenous organizations since she was a teenager, and at 40 decided to approach that work in a very different way, obtaining her law degree from UBC at 43. She has practiced law in the public and private sector since then, primarily advocating for residential school survivors. She graduated from UBC with a Master of Fine Arts degree in Creative Writing MFA in 2014, where her novel Five Little Indians first started taking shape. Her poetry and short stories have appeared in a number of publications. Her first novel, Five Little Indians, which we'll speak primarily about today, won the HarperCollins UBC Best New Fiction Prize and our very own Kobo Emerging Writer Prize for Literary Fiction. And her poetry has been included in Best Canadian Poetry in Canada 2016 and Best of Best Canadian Poetry in Canada 2017. Michelle's currently working on her second novel. So welcome, Michelle. We're so grateful to have you here with us. There's a ton I'm excited to talk to you about with this book. Just to let you know, we'll also leave some time at the end for some questions from the group as well. So anyone from Kobo that has any questions, please feel free to post either directly in the Zoom chat or to Slack Renee directly as well. Either way will work. But again, thank you again, Michelle, for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here. I was really happy to get the invitation. Not just because this is, my life's work to talk about the subject of this book, but also to have an opportunity to express my thanks for the Kobo Emerging Award, which, for me is a wonderful thing. But to have the award itself, to acknowledge emerging writers is so important because it's such a struggle. It is such a struggle to get that first book out. And when you do, to have some acknowledgement for you, it elevates not only the book, but you as a writer. And I just was very, very pleased and humbled and thankful for that. So thank you.
Of course, honestly, very, very well deserved, of course, and leads very well into my first question, which is that reading this book, it's such a beautiful expression of trauma, resilience, love, and healing. Has tons of accolades already, including from us, and it deserves every award it's received. Even Howie notes kind of the healing power of telling your story. Can you tell us more about the journey that went into writing the novel and anything you learned during that process?
What a long journey it was. That book developed over a 9-year period, from writing the first paragraph in the fall of 2011 to, its release in the spring of 2020. It was a long and arduous journey, and actually started before then, in the sense that I've been threatening to write this book for decades, right? Whenever somebody would confront me with profound ignorance, right? I was just like, oh my God, I have to write a book. I just have to write a book. And it was the same thing, I was 40 when I went to law school, and, it was the same kind of moment of reflection. If I don't do this now, I likely won't. And so I was still practicing law when I went into the MFA program, and I was running my own little firm. I went to the MFA program specifically to write this book because I knew with my other obligations, without a very specific structure that obligated me to other student colleagues, that I likely wouldn't give it the time that it needed. primarily, the real drive to write this book came from the response that I would hear individually, but also what I would observe in media, whether it's online media, newspapers, interviews, comments, whatever, about, from, sort of just average Canadians asking quite legitimately and often without venom, why can't they just get over it? And it was so infuriating and just so confounding that people just didn't understand what they were saying when they uttered that question. Why can't they just get over it? Get over it, So I've been starting to try and really condense my responses to those kinds of questions so that they're more easily or that they more effectively trigger an understanding. But I have started to respond to that with a question. What exactly is it that you think we should get over? What exactly is it that you think we should forget? 130 years of coming to our doorsteps and saying, we're here for your children. 130 years of children not coming home with no explanation. Sometimes parents never knew. There are 197 First Nations in British Columbia. Imagine 197 communities with no school-age children. And when we speak of intergenerational trauma, we often think of the children of residential school survivors, but it goes in the other direction as well, because the parents are traumatized by the kidnapping of their children, the use of law and policy to do that. The grandparents, generations of our ancestors who were prevented from communicating traditions, language, culture, protocols, and so on. And then, of course, the children. So that's what we're being asked to forget. That's what we're being asked to get over. And nobody would say, let's forget the Jewish Holocaust, right?
Thank you for sharing that, because that's such an important message, especially as you mentioned, like even with politicians and media constantly referring to these tragedies as such a dark part of Canada's history, but it's not the history, it's a current and persisting issue. And you're absolutely right. This book does such a good job at answering that question of how can you say this is history when this is really what it looks like? Speaking of, I know that, I read that the book is largely based on the experiences of your family. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
I wouldn't say that it's largely based on experiences of my family, but there are allusions to experiences that my mother and my grandmother had at residential schools. When I first started working, you mentioned at the beginning that I began working with Indigenous organizations when I was 18. I had just aged out of foster care at that point, and I was living in Vancouver. I was living in the setting at the time that the book opens up, that the book starts. And everybody that I worked with, all of the Indigenous people that I worked with in these organizations were survivors. They were people that within, the last 10 years from that time had come out of residential school. So my entire world was observing and being in relationship with people who had immediately experienced this. So it really became, a significant part of the fabric of my life. And seeing people trying to cope, people that are trying to do something, politically important at the same time, coping with, deep trauma. That was it isn't really something I had to learn, because it was something I lived in just my day-to-day life.
What really struck me about the book is, especially because it has 5 protagonists that interact with each other largely throughout the book, there's really a theme of community there. And it was really clear that community kind of helped them heal in a way. Can you talk a bit about the importance of community in both when they're enduring injustices at the time and healing from it thereafter?
Absolutely. And, I really appreciate that question, because community is so critical in survival. And even the emergence of Indigenous activism in the 60s and 70s helped solidify that sense of community, that these lost souls, that no longer fit in their families, no longer fit in their communities, that they could create their own community to support and encourage each other. There's a passage in the book where that notion of community is observed. And we're talking about the downtown east side in that. But I described, or I said in there, or the narrator said that people would be uncomfortable in the downtown east side. Basically, that's what it was inferring. But that it was like, it was their neighborhood, it was their community with all of the comforts and joys of any other community. It was their home, their place of belonging. The sense of community that I really, really wanted to emphasize was the relationships between the 5 protagonists and how their shared experiences at the residential school bound them together forever. And I guess the understanding that I wanted to convey there is that nobody else would understand. It's like a war veteran. Nobody else is going to understand what they experienced, but in the community that they create with each other, they don't have to explain, they don't have to show, they don't have to excuse, they don't have to do any of that, because without words, without anything, they understand. And they understand what each other needs in terms of care and support.
One part of the book that struck me that's kind of relevant is there was a part where Lucy's off studying nursing finally, and she mentions that she longs to work at the hotel again. And that really struck me because supposedly she should be in a better place now. She's moved on from this, what was objectively a terrible job, but longed for that space again, just because that was at least a space where she had her people around her. This being like also a diversity and inclusion talk, it really struck me because what stood out to me about that is that it's really not enough just to be let into spaces. Yes. You need to be fully welcomed and included as you are. So I really love that you pointed that out and included that in your book. That was really important to me too.
Yeah, and it wasn't about her wanting to be back at the crappy job at the manager with horrible Harlan, right? It was the manager, for those of you who haven't read the book. It was about, having no community, having no sense of belonging in that hospital where she was training, having nobody has her back, nobody understands what she's going through, and just missing that camaraderie and community. It's not that these things were premeditated in the writing. It was just the reality that was reflected in the story. It was the reality that was a part of the story. And I often say this, that readers write the book. Once the book is released, it's no longer my book. It's the reader's book. And, the readers complete the writing of the book by what they put between the lines, right? As you have done with that observation about the issue of inclusivity and belonging in places where you wouldn't normally belong. So, I love that. I've loved watching that as people respond to the book. It's been great.
That's beautiful. I love that. I also noticed that there was, this is mostly just a curiosity thing, but I noticed there was one chapter where that wasn't named after one of the 5 residential school survivors. The chapter named Mariah, where Clara first ends up at her cabin. So I'm mostly just curious, was there a specific reason for that?
Yes, and I had a big fight with my editor about it. I shouldn't say that. My editor is the most lovely woman, and we had and have a really great working relationship, but she said it just makes it stick out. It's not consistent, blah, 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 typical editorial comments. And I insisted. The reason that I insisted is that that's what I wanted it to do. I wanted people to go, pay attention, right? This is a little different. And also because what happens at Mariah's cabin with Clara and Mariah is so important to the whole concept of where Indigenous people, I want to say must go, but can go for real healing and a return to an accurate reflection of themselves. And that is what is missing. And, I want to say something here. There's some talk right now, there's some work right now going on in Edmonton about renaming a street. And the street is currently named after Bishop Vital Grandin, who was a key player in promoting the residential schools. And I have this little quote from him in the late 1800s. It's a little quote. He says, "We instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life, so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. Yeah. And so that's why I needed to really do like a dark underline under that chapter and call it Mariah, because Mariah is reflective of healing. Mariah is reflective of the cultural traditions and the accurate way of perceiving ourselves, as opposed to being humiliated by the concept of being Indigenous. Isn't that awful? Isn't that just like, and so for anybody who might think, because there are people that still do, and I mean, I don't say this with judgment in any way, but, for anybody that thinks that this was incidental, unintentional harm, that this kind of harm was not intended, that this was an innocent thing, that should change your mind.
It's so heavy whenever it comes up, and I want to thank you for bringing it to our attention as well and sharing that. Something about Clara's whole journey throughout the book also struck me, because even in the beginning when she was at the school, it almost seemed, and correct me if I'm wrong, it almost seemed like she was almost the most like successfully indoctrinated. I remember when Lily was sick, she was genuinely praying to
Yes.
the Christian God to help heal her, and almost it was clear that obviously those prayers weren't answered, and she really was broken by and affected by the loss of like almost all spirituality in that sense. Like she was truly fueled by rage the rest of her life. And seeing that journey and the deep work it took with Mariah to unlearn that first, because she was very resistant at first.
Afraid. And that's something that I think is really important to understand, is that there were children in these schools whose tongues were pierced with needles when they spoke their language. If they spoke their language, and often, like my mother, they didn't speak any other language when they were brought to the schools. I'm not saying that was widespread or anything, but it happened. And certainly they were physically abused if they spoke their language or referred to, their own ways of being and so on. But with Clara, her story about her spirituality and her sense of her place in the world really starts when she's walking through that grove of birch trees, coming home from church when she's a little wee girl. And, I struggled with that decision to have her and her mother going to church, but it's accurate. And, that was reflective of the previous generation to, Clara's parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. Remember, this went on since, the early mid to late 1800s. And so, that church indoctrination was already woven into the Indigenous communities. Clara's journey started when she hears her angels in the birch trees, right? And with her mother saying, your grandmother says that's a place where the little people live. And the little people are, they're like little messengers from the spirit world. That was, a perfect encapsulation of Indigenous spirituality and an indication to this child that she had a spiritual role to play and a spiritual place in the world. So it starts there, and then she goes to school and, carries on the indoctrination and so on and so forth. But she had to experience that in order to understand that it wasn't her, that it wasn't her ultimate spiritual fabric. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about because Clara ends up becoming this incredible activist who I think we should all want to be a Clara, I think. And you have been advocating for survivors of the residential school system for years. What changes have you seen that do give you hope? And what do you wish people took more urgent action on?
We see the response to this book, which shocks me. It continues to shock me that this has sort of gone through the stratosphere, so to speak. Some people respond to the title, the 5 Little Indians, right? And, things like nomenclature, where now we're called Indigenous, when people are moving away from this sort of pan-Indian kind of conception and this understanding that we are unique peoples with unique cultures across the country, that we're not all one people. I think that there is a growing understanding. But the thing that continues to sort of knock my socks off is in the responses that I get to the book. Like, readers reach out and they send me messages through my webpage, and they almost to a one start with, every Canadian should read this book. But they also virtually all of them say, we just didn't know this was happening. We didn't know. And I have two responses to that in myself. I mean, not necessarily ones that I would write to people. But, one of them is, why? Why is this new to you? And when we look at the discovery of the unmarked graves that, has been happening, we've known about that forever. Plus, there are government documents that refer to the death rate in the residential schools that go back to 1907. So why is this news? And why is it that we had to come up with the evidence? We had to produce the skeletons in order for people to accept that, in fact, this happened. And I recently saw a post on Facebook that said, oh, this is just an effort to attack Christians again. It was natural causes, okay? And to that, I say, I'm going to do a big, long answer to this question. Some of you may have heard of a man named Dr. Peter Bryce. Dr. Bryce was the chief medical officer for the federal government for the Department of Indian Affairs. And he was commissioned in the early 1900s to do a review of the conditions of the residential school, arising largely from, huge numbers of complaints from Indigenous parents. He came back and he said in his report, if we had been commissioned to create a circumstance that would promote the transmission of tuberculosis, we have done this with the residential school. I'll give you another little quote. He said, even war seldom shows as large a percentage of fatalities as does the education system we have imposed on our Indian wards. Duncan Campbell Scott's response to this, who was the chief superintendent of Indian Affairs, says, it is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of the department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Ultimately, there will be not one Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic. There will be no Indian problem and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott used the term final solution before Hitler did in Canada. And Scott was also quoted later in an essay saying, it's quite within the mark to say that 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education which they had received therein. 50%, not in all the schools, but yeah, 50%. So why don't people know this? Imagine if this was non-Indigenous schools and 50% of the kids were dying. Okay, imagine if COVID just went wild in all the schools and the people said, well, we still want them to learn their ABCs. So it's okay if they die. It's okay if they die. But it takes me back, like I say, my big, long, rambling answer takes me back to the reason that people don't know is because they were not intended to know. Mm. These schools were total institutions, which means no oversight, no such thing as an ombudsperson to complain to. And there's a wonderful book that I recommend to people. It's called Seeing Red. I always forget the second part of the title, but it's something to the effect of Natives in Canadian newspapers. And what it's about is how the media has been complicit with government, and they call media curriculum, where it's teaching people what to think. It's teaching people how, that whole theme of we're helping the poor Native child, was supported by media. It was supported by all of the subliminal influences that we experience in society. But if anybody ever really wanted to know, all they had to do was just look just slightly below the surface. And I think that's what's finally happening, after 130 years, is that people are going, wait a minute, what? And they're, and I hear that again in responses to the book, where people are just horrified and shocked. And that is a change. That is progression. But I also feel strongly, and I say it regularly, that non-Indigenous people need to take responsibility for their own education. We are burdened with that. People come to us all the time. We have carried the responsibility for, fighting against the resistance to the education, and then also putting in that work. It's been us that has done this. And we're living with the impacts of residential schools, the impacts of colonialism, and we need to put our energies there. And so non-Indigenous people need to step up, take responsibility, read a book, go jump into the archives, Google Duncan Campbell Scott, right? Google timeline of residential schools. Just these simple little internet searches will provide you with just an incredible amount of information. And I mean, I did my research because I started an LLM program before I decided I didn't want to do an LLM. And but I had done all the research, and that's where I originally found all of this stuff. And it was before, that was like in the year 2000. So it was before all of this was so accessible. It was like in the dusty archives then. It's there. If people want to know, if they want to learn, it's there. I'm going to read you one more quote and then we'll move on. This one is from Sir John A. Macdonald, and it's to the House of Commons in 1883. And he says, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thoughts are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes and thought of white men." That's in the House of Commons debate. Anybody wants to find this stuff, they can. Right? Yeah, go to the Hansards. You'll find everything you want to know. I think that just sort of opens a window onto the mindset of who we were, of how non-Indigenous people in colonial Canada thought we were, how they thought of us.
Thank you for sharing all those important calls to action. I urge all of us, and I hope all of us will follow those, and because they're so crucial, and it's we need to put in the work. Absolutely, like you said.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be bossy.
Our pleasure. No, this is what we need to do. We also know that you're currently working on your second novel. Is there anything you can share with us about that?
Yeah, it's another work of historical fiction. This one goes back starting in 1856 and is loosely based on my great-grandmother and my mother. And I'm Cree, as you know. My great-grandmother was the niece of Chief Big Bear, who was very, very prominent chief in the prairies and was largely responsible for the negotiations of Treaty 6. She, of course, was in his band and was at what is called the Frog Lake Massacre. I refer to it as the Frog Lake Incident. What was going on at the time? I'll go back a little bit. How many people know that Regina, the city of Regina, used to be called Pile of Bones? And yes, that's another really good one to Google, right? Because what you'll see is a picture of a guy, like a man, and he's a buffalo hunter, and he's about this big. And next to him is a pile of bones that is about this big. And what happened was, settlers and, colonial folk were encouraged to just kill buffalo. And bison. They used to get on the trains and they would just shoot them off the trains, just kill them off. And the reason for that is that buffalo and bison were food, clothing, and shelter for Indigenous people. Okay. And so So what they did is they created a circumstance of imposed starvation. And then through treaty and treaty negotiations, provided rations so that people wouldn't die. And what Sir John A. Macdonald did in a directive to Indian agents was he told them to withhold rations to force people to sign treaty, even if the terms of the treaty were not what they wanted at that time. This is what was going on in Frog Lake, and there was a very sadistic Indian agent up there who was withholding the rations. And the structure of the band is Big Bear was the chief, but he had co-chiefs who had specific responsibilities, and the war chief took over. It had been weeks since they had been given any food. They were starving. They were boiling twigs to feed the children. It was just a disaster. And he confronted the Indian agent. The Indian agent laughed at him, so he killed him. And he killed several people at Frog Lake. And then, of course, they're all on the lam, right? So the Northwest Mounted Police came in and hounded them across the border into Montana. And there were a couple of skirmishes in between times. And then they were in Montana. They were welcomed by the Rocky Boy Reservation. Long story longer, there was ultimately an amnesty and they were allowed to come back. And those that chose to come back were put in a boxcar. Like, what kind of image does that inspire? And they were brought into Alberta. And to this day, there is a First Nation in Alberta called the Montana Band of Cree. So my great-grandmother never saw a non-Indigenous person until she was in her late teens, maybe even 20, because Frog Lake happened in 1885. She was born in 1856. And so what we have in her and in the character that is based on her in this book is a pre-colonial Indigenous woman. Yes, of course, in other parts of Canada, the colonization was, more advanced, but we have a woman living a traditional Cree lifestyle. Yes. And then we have her coming into collision, right, with the colonial forces. And then we see, how her life unfolded with that and her influence on my mother as a result of those experiences. So the other underlying theme that I want this book to have, similar to Five Little Indians, is how it became entrenched in Canadian society that Indigenous women are disposable and that it's okay to rape, brutalize, and kill Indigenous women. My grandfather was a child of rape. My great-grandmother's, who is in the story, son was a child of rape by a Northwest Mounted Police officer. Therein is a truth that we continue to see in the just shocking rates of Indigenous women that are being murdered and going missing. So that's that. That's kind of what the story is. And my mother was a force of nature.
I believe it.
Yeah. Oh my God, my mother. They're just, yeah. She went from residential school to nurses training in New Zealand. She was so determined to get an education. And in Canada, it was illegal for Indigenous people to get an education beyond grade 9. And so she fought her way through this and that and this and that. And, with the support of the Anglican Church, she got a scholarship to take midwifery and nursing training with Maori women in New Zealand. So all of that is going to be, her story in that sense is going to be part of this novel as well. So long story longer, never ask me a question. Never ask me an open-ended question. I'll go on.
No, we love it. Oh my goodness. I'm so excited for your second novel to come out. We're hoping for it to come out the fall of 2023. I have a deadline for first draft of April. So you're going to be among the last people I'm doing events with because I got to get back to writing. That's fair. We're very honored that we have you for this. But yeah, I'm so excited. Honestly, I can kind of already get a sense that because of the similar structure to Five Little Indians, I feel like what you do really well is your books are very all encompassing. It doesn't deny any of the trauma but it doesn't deny any of the joy either as they heal through it. It's a very complete picture.
Well, and that's, something, I can't remember who, somebody asked me about that. And I said, in every life, no matter how awful it is, no matter what terrible adversity someone is facing, there's always joy. There's always the love, and there's always, everything. And I wanted these characters to be whole people, not there. We are much more than our trauma. We are whole living people with every experience in life that everybody has. I didn't want it to be trauma porn, it's just, like, and also, there's a lot of humor in the book.
Yeah, there is.
And
they're funny people.
And humor has become a real healing mechanism. We use humor to make light of the things that try to destroy us. And so I that was really an important part of the development of these characters as well. Yeah.
Just keeping an eye on time. I have one last question before we get to any audience questions, but this Kobo is a book company after all, so we'd love to know, what have you been reading lately that's made an impact on you?
I can't say why I've been reading all these books, but I read 138 books on top of everything else that I'm doing since May.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And so I can't talk about why I've been doing that, but it will eventually be known. But I recently read Katharina Vermette's book. It's not out yet. I read it as an ARC. Katharina's my friend. We went to the MFA program together at UBC, and she's written a new book called The Strangers, and it's beautiful. It's just beautiful. So it's out on the 28th of September, and I highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Yeah, very good. Yeah, she's a wonderful Métis author for those who may not have heard of her. Oh, and I had to read it on my Kobo. All those books.
As
there
it was. Right. Any questions coming in from?
Yes. Somebody says, Tara says that it's nominated. This book is nominated for a Giller, and it is. Yeah. So I'm just so rooting for Katharina. Yeah.
Micah has a question. What kind of things can Kobo do to promote Indigenous writers?
Well, one of these things is, I mentioned earlier my appreciation for the Emerging Writers Award. I think, something like that, maybe not necessarily an award, but maybe, like ongoing contests for Indigenous writers, those kinds of things give people profile, perhaps highlighting Indigenous works, maybe offering an Indigenous work to come with a Kobo or something like that. I think, those kinds of things really, sort of like the incidental support, right? Where, I'm going to get a Kobo anyway, but with it, I'm going to get Katharina's book, right? Something like that, preloaded to a Kobo or something. Off the top of my head, that's, maybe an idea.
And then one from Tara. She mentions that she really loves your book and that your next book includes the Maori aspect. It's so important for people to be aware of how systematically this has happened during colonialism worldwide. Has there been actions in New Zealand that you think Canada can do, or vice versa?
Oh, absolutely. The Maori have a bit of an advantage, right? In Canada, the Indigenous populations are so diverse. We have Longhouse people on the West Coast, we have Prairie people, we have, Fisher people on the East Coast. We have such a huge diversity. In BC alone, there's 52 different dialects, different languages, and then more sub-dialects and so on. But with the Maori, they're all one language, all one people. And that's been an advantage to them in terms of their organizing, because they don't have a government that's trying to get everybody to agree on things that don't necessarily work for one group, or anyway. But they have developed a Maori Parliament, which is really, really, really quite fantastic and an excellent example. They're also very heavily present in universities throughout New Zealand, and much sooner than they were in Canada. I mean, we're starting to see that developing now in Canada. But, it's also a bit of a haven for Pretendians in Canada. So, but yeah, definitely those kinds of things. And there's been, quite a strong relationship between the Maori and Canadian Indigenous organizations. So I think that, their successes and their initiatives are something that we've considered for a long time. I was actually involved with the World Council of Indigenous People when I was 18. I was just a little kid.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
And, was introduced to some Maori leaders at that time. And it was just spectacular, just a wonderful thing. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question that are your books available in Spanish and or Portuguese and published in Latin America? There's an entire Spanish and Portuguese speaking continent that also has a lot of descendants of Native Americans with horror stories like yours that will resonate strongly.
No, but that's something that might happen. We have had some interest from different countries to translate the book into different languages, but not any Latin American countries yet. But it's early days. It's still early days for that kind of development, and I'm really hoping that it will expand because, as you say, like particularly if you think about Mexico, Mexicans are Indigenous people primarily, and that's something that I think would resonate in that population as well. Yeah.
We'll look forward to that day. We have a question from Shanice that it's so important to see Indigenous presences in media and on screens, and we're only just seeing more and more projects in development. Are there Indigenous-centered movies or TV shows that you'd recommend?
I don't watch TV. I don't even own a TV.
Oh, okay.
But Monkey Beach is one that I would highly recommend, primarily because I know Eden and I know Loretta Todd, and they're both so wonderful in what they do. But you might be able to see Five Little Indians soon. Ooh. The option for a limited series has been picked up. And
congratulations.
I know, I'm amazing. Excited. Well, I'm very excited about it because I think it's a very visual book.
It is. On
one hand, but on the other hand, my son was very dyslexic, and it was very sad to me because he would have rather poked himself in the eye than read a book because it was such a challenge. And there's lots of people that don't read for one reason or another. And so this, I think, would give an opportunity for this story to be told in a different media, if you will, medium, I mean. And the screenwriter, who is one of the producers, is Cree. So I'm really, really delighted about that. So I mean, it's a long process to get that from beginning to, release, but fingers crossed, we're looking for a broadcaster. So yeah.
Oh, amazing. I can't wait to, I can't wait to watch that. I am ecstatic at that news, to be honest. And we have a question also from Zach. You spoke a little bit about humor, laughter, and joy as part of the Indigenous resilience. Where are some of the places where you look for and find Indigenous joy?
Me, personally, my community, my family, my co-workers, my colleagues, my characters who are like my children. These characters still live with me. I mean, they hung around my consciousness for 9 years, and they feel like family, and I think of them a lot from time to time. And I think the joy is so critical, and I particularly find that in my spirituality. I practice traditional spirituality, and it not only is a joyful experience, it's a peaceful one. It engenders peace. When I'm raging, which you might not think that because we're having a happy talk today, but when I'm raging, that's where I go to remember that there's so much to be thankful for and to be at peace, and that, everything is as it should be. Everything is moving forward, and to just do your best. And that's what I tell everybody, just do your best.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And we also have an important question, I think, from Tracy. She mentions that she's ashamed to not have known more about the residential schools. Is anything happening now that needs to be seen and understood?
The body count is over 6,000 now, and that's with only a handful. of residential school sites. And I think, when we talk about allyship, I think what people need to consider is how they can use their privilege and their voice. And this is already fading, right? This issue of the unmarked graves is already fading from media attention because it's no longer news. And I think it's something that, and I know that people often, their hackles might get up a little bit when people talk about privilege, about white privilege. And they think, wait a minute, my parents were poor. I've had to work hard for everything that I've had in my life and so on. Privilege isn't to say that that's not true. What privilege is that you didn't have to overcome your identity. You didn't have to overcome being brown or other, if you will, in order to achieve your goals in life. And to use that privilege, raise your voice, and don't step back, don't stop. We need drinking. Why? I watched online, the debates in this election, and one of the questions was about drinkable, potable water for Indigenous people. Why is that even a question? Yes or no? Are you kidding me? And you have to remember that the primary motivation of any politician is to become prime minister and to hold on to power.
Yes.
And you have the franchise, you have the vote. Vote accordingly. I won't say who.
I think we have time for one last question coming in from Sam. She had never heard the term Pretendians before. She just Googled it as you mentioned it. Can you speak a little bit to your experience with people who would fit into that category?
Oh, well, first of all, you can go to the Globe, and I wrote an essay on Pretendians for the Globe a few months ago. You can find that, and it's actually a pretty good analysis of the whole thing. The title is something about the harm caused by play Indians. Joseph Boyden, probably the most notorious Pretendian, was my thesis supervisor.
Oh.
And I didn't understand why he offered me basically nothing until that. I mean, I had my suspicions about him. Like, I kept telling people, something's off here. Something doesn't feel right here. And this was in, 2011 through 14. And then afterwards, when it was, my suspicions were confirmed, I realized, oh, he doesn't want my voice out there as competition, right? I mean, anyway, so the real danger and the harm caused by Pretendians is, and it's huge, actually, it's a huge issue, is that they are presenting a palatable and inaccurate perception of Indigenous people. I refer to Boyden as the palatable Indian, okay, in the sense that he is the colonial reflection of the noble savage. I mean, oh my God, sometimes I just shake my head at the things that he has said publicly. And he was an honorary witness for the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. And that is just a travesty. He knows nothing. He was educated by the Jesuits, for God's sake. Okay. But that's the point. That's the issue, is that what they're doing is they're promoting colonial values, colonial perceptions of Indigenous people. They are not legitimate and they are not authentic. And that harms us significantly. It sets us back. Yeah.
Thank you for teaching us about that. I believe that's our time, but truly, I wanted to thank you again, Michelle, for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm sure I can speak for everyone here when I say we found this so valuable and crucial. Your book is absolutely, I agree with all the people who have sent you messages that every Canadian should read this. Absolutely, they should. You're an absolute force, and it's been a joy chatting with you. Thank you again, and thank you again to everyone for joining and for sending the resources along in the chat. I'm sure we'll include that in the recording link as well. But thank you again, and take care, everyone.
Well, and thank you again. Thank you again. I really appreciate the opportunities to have these conversations, and I think these conversations are necessary. So if you're looking for something to do, anything to do, have a conversation.
Thank you for listening to this bonus episode of the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in picking up Five Little Indians, we will include a link to it in our show notes, as well as links to any resources Michelle spoke about.
This episode was hosted by Alyssa Andino, and huge thanks to Michelle Good for being our guest.